Hey there, Nightmare fans. Deandra here with a bonus episode for you today, October the 14th, because we are celebrating the 24th anniversary of Wes Craven's New Nightmare, the meta film that was released 10 years after the original A Nightmare on Elm Street. Even though Wes is known for having the meta elements in the Scream franchise, and that franchise is iconic for a lot of that, for having those meta elements, Wes Craven's New Nightmare came before that, and really, I think is the first film to be so meta and self-aware of the effects of creating something so iconic as a horror franchise that has all these fans, the effects on the fans, on movie studios, on the people who actually made the movies. And the film has mixed reviews, but we'll get into that later. In any case, the synopsis is that Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy Thompson, is pretty much over Freddy Krueger. She has a husband, she has a little kid, and she's just ready to move on with her life. But nope, Freddy keeps haunting her in many ways. One of those ways is a stalker who's calling her, and she's having all these nightmares, and she's just ready to move on. But she goes to an interview because she played Nancy, and of course, Freddy's super iconic. The whole time she's like, Freddy's dead, and you could tell how she feels. But here comes Robert. Everybody loves Freddy. Everybody's chanting it for Freddy. And even after that, everybody wants his autograph, but she's in the back, like checking her watch, eating a grape. She's ready to go. And then she gets a call from New Line Cinema. And she meets with Bob Shea, and she learns that Wes is writing a new movie. And she's just not really having it. Then weird stuff starts to happen. And Freddy jumps off the silver screen into her life. So she figures, well, I'm going through hell. Might as well go to the one person who might know something, Wes Craven. And that's when she learns that Wes thought he was writing dreams, but those dreams were actually premonitions for what is to come in reality. She also learns that Freddy is actually an ancient evil who loves the essence of Freddy from the films. And because they're not making the movies anymore, now the genie is out of the bottle and he's ready to wreak havoc on reality. But he has to go through one person first, the person with the strength, the person who is Freddy's greatest foe, Nancy Thompson. And of course, since Nancy is a character, there's one person who gave Nancy her strength and has the power to defeat Freddy, and that is Heather Langenkamp. So Heather has to make the decision whether or not she's going to play Nancy one last time. And to save her son, and I guess the world, she agrees in epic fashion. And speaking of epic fashion, at the very end, we get two great words we've always wanted Nancy to say to Freddy, which is, fuck you, and then she punches him in the face. And it's great. The film itself is fantastic. I love how much it really focuses in on the reality element, and by incorporating a lot of different aspects of, trying to make it like a documentary. No title sequence, which is great. Some of the lighting, the way it is, and the acting is phenomenal. I think it's pretty much everybody's best acting in this movie, and Wes really kicked up filmmaking a notch with New Nightmare. I love the elements like Hansel and Gretel, that Dylan and Heather are Hansel and Gretel, and they're battling the witch, which is this Freddy entity, and they just want to get back to their normal lives like Hansel and Gretel did, so they throw Freddy / the witch into the fire, which I think is great. And I love this movie because of the quality of filmmaking, and because I've always been a huge fan of analyzing horror and getting into the symbolic and the psychological aspects of horror. And I think this film really gets to that just by looking at Freddy as an ancient entity. Because there's always been the battle of good and evil since the beginning of time. And now that continues in this story. It's like going back to Shakespeare. When Shakespeare, there's all these different elements of stories. And every story that is created is a derivative of that main core story. And this, in that same way, and Freddy and good and evil is like that. This is the battle between fear and evil, and that's what Freddy has always been, and that's what he is in reality. And he's also that dark part of people that, you know, we need to address, that Heather needs to address, that you can't just dust under the rug. You have to face it. You really have to face it, whether it's evil or whether it is the reputation that a film franchise that you've been a part of has created. Every time people ask me what my favorite nightmare is, of course they know it has to be one of 3 films because of my love for Nancy Thompson, but they're usually always surprised when I tell them it is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I did not like the film at first. When I watched it back when I was in my early days of fandom, I kind of hated it. I was happy that Heather was back, but she wasn't Nancy. I was disappointed. I wanted Nancy to come back from the grave so Nancy wasn't dead anymore, but no, that's not what the film was. And Freddy wasn't actually Freddy. I mean, he was, but he was different. He had a freaky colored greenish red sweater thing that was not the same colors as the other movies. He had like pleather pants on with boots and a trench coat and a claw hand, and his skin was split and not burned. I was like, what even is this? But the more I began to analyze the franchise and watch the films and really delve into them, the more I appreciated New Nightmare for a lot of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. The filmmaking, the symbolic elements of it. And it's really nice to see more people today expressing their love for it. And you can shoot me for saying this, but please don't. But I've noticed that people who are, and this is not meant to be elitist, but who are the most passionate, knowledgeable, and involved members of the A Nightmare on Elm Street community, also level-headed, like Wes Craven's New Nightmare. They appreciate it as a film. When I wrote a paper in college on the film, my professor had never seen it. And he wasn't really a big horror fan, but he knew of A Nightmare on Elm Street, of course, and he'd seen it several times. And he decided to watch New Nightmare, and he loved it. It became his new favorite horror film. Although, when Roger Ebert was talking about the film, he was met with criticism in a way, because how he felt about the film was that it was so... It stirred up a lot of emotions. It wasn't just a typical horror movie. Siskel did not agree, of course, when they were interviewing or reviewing it and talking back and forth. He thought it was just a glorified slasher film. I felt that New Nightmare was almost a drama about horror because of its meta elements, but it's still very much a horror film. It's just got more of the thrills and the psychological elements to it than the kills in the film. And it goes back to storytelling. It's all about storytelling. Because even though we've talked on the show about the later A Nightmare on Elm Street films, how there was a need for excess in the 80s and the need to capitalize, and there was the MTV era and, you know, big kind of blockbuster elements, and so Freddy had to kind of morph into that, and he did when Robert came to the forefront, so the films got pretty silly. And this film stripped away those elements of just pushing Freddy to the forefront, and they focused back on the other characters, on the story, on the battle of good versus evil, keeping it pretty simple, even though the concept of the film is complicated and complex. It's still very simple in the battle of good versus evil, where good's transformation and good's journey is at the center and not the villain. So it's still scary, and it still makes for a great film. to watch. And so I love New Nightmare. And I hope you do too. And if you don't, let me know in the comments. This is just me rambling on and on and on about New Nightmare. And hopefully, I think we'll probably have another episode where we delve into the film itself. But I hope you've enjoyed this little bonus episode from me. And go celebrate New Nightmare by actually watching it. I mean, I freaking love it. Hopefully, you can look at it through different eyes. Try not to judge it as a slasher film, but just as a film in general, as a piece of cinema. Also, I recommend picking up the novelization of New Nightmare because it's really interesting to get into some of the thoughts of the characters, especially Heather and her reactions during the events of New Nightmare. I love that book, so check that out as well. And what are your favorite moments in New Nightmare? I would say, for me, it would have to be a tie between when Heather accepts playing Nancy one last time. When she turns around, she sees the house, and she's talking to John, and she calls him Dad, and all of that. I love that. The other thing would be the freeway scene, rather. I love the music in that and the action and her screaming, and it's just so great. It just keeps you on edge. Pretty much from the time she leaves the hospital to when she's kind of go down that chute is my favorite part of the movie. I love all of that. But what are your favorite parts of New Nightmare? What do you think about New Nightmare? Has your opinion of it changed over the years? Let me know. And to close out this bonus episode, please enjoy this little snippet of an interview with the master himself, Wes Craven. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep.
Every one of us in that series had been somehow touched forever by the phenomenon of Nightmare on Elm Street. Robert Englund was always known as Freddy, and Heather and Nancy were inextricable. New Line Cinema had sort of been built on it. So when I came away from that conversation, I called up Bob Shea and I said, I think I want to make a movie about the phenomenon of the movie and use that as the basis and jump outside the stories entirely, and also try to deal with this whole idea of censorship and whether horror films are good or bad or whether they cause people to do things. Because that has been sort of a growing and insistent question continuously asked of me, and I think everybody else making horror films, is, aren't you afraid your films cause this or that? And my sense was, again, going all the way back to Greek mythology, is there's a lot of great literature that is about horror, and that somehow a story about horror, in a sense, exercises it or gives it a form. It's the same as Nancy dragging the hat out of her dream. It's the beginning of being able to come to terms with it. And that if you were to prevent these stories, you would, in a sense, be allowing something that is ineffable to sort of travel unimpeded through our consciousness, because it would not have a name, it would not have a shape given to it, so that in any sense we could recognize it. So that became the essence of it. Stopping the stories of Freddy has really allowed Freddy to cross over into real life. And it was kind of a subtle warning to the censors on my part to say, back off unless you want to experience the real thing rather than seeing it in cinema, And it also seemed to be the freshest way to approach the kind of the 10th year anniversary of the genre, which it, in fact, that was. Almost to the month, it was the 10th year of the original Nightmare on Elm Street.